With the upcoming remake of Dragon Quest III, I thought it'd be fun to take a look at the past, talk about what the differences are between the different versions of Dragon Quest III, and talk a lot about the specific differences in the new remake. Many of the Dragon Quest games have been released and then re-released multiple times over the last 30 or so years, and that is definitely the case for Dragon Quest III. It isn't the first time that it has had a remake. There are also some interesting differences in the American version of Dragon Quest III, which was still called Dragon Warrior at the time of its release, and that was due to some copyright issues from a tabletop role-playing game that was also called Dragon Quest. The series would go on to continue being Dragon Warrior all the way up to 2005. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first version of the game, which is the NES version. The NES version, or the Famicom version of Dragon Quest III, Dragon Warrior 3 in America, wasn't only different in name, but it also had very different box art. Box art for the Japanese versions of the Dragon Quest games has always been very different, and honestly, we tend to get pretty, in my opinion, inferior versions of the box. Honestly though, the cover of the US version of Dragon Quest III, it's not bad, but the Japanese version is pretty clearly better. It has art done by Akira Toriyama, after all, so that's gonna be better. So this version is 8-bit graphics, of course. It's got a simple chiptune style of music and sound effects. I think this is the first time that the class system was introduced to the series. There was no day-night cycle. You'll see why that matters later on. And it has pretty linear storytelling with fairly basic exploration. Uses passwords in the Japanese version, but in the American version, it has the battery save function for the NES version. So there are already some differences there just between the Japanese version and the American version. And then, some years later, they put out a new version of the game, which was for the Super Famicom, the SNES. It was a Japan-only release, but this was the first remake of Dragon Quest III, and it had some pretty significant differences, actually. Upgraded the entire game to 16-bit graphics, so that means more detailed environments, character sprites, monster designs all got updated. There's enhanced sound quality with some orchestrated-ish sounding music. And this is where they introduced the day-night cycle. So this is something that affects the gameplay, it affects different quests and what NPCs do, which is pretty cool. It's very early game for there to be a day-night cycle. There's also differences in the interface, improved menus, smoother gameplay mechanics in general. The save system, this time in Japan even, it had a battery save with multiple save slots. So those poor people in Japan had to deal with a password system back on the Famicom, so that is unfortunate. But now, with this Super Famicom version, they didn't. It also has some additional content, but it's not a whole ton of that. There's some minor content that changes in it, and there's also some quality of life improvements, obviously. And then pushing a little bit more into the future, there is the Game Boy Color version of Dragon Quest III. A lot of people say that the Game Boy Color version is actually the definitive version, which is kind of interesting. You would think that the Super Famicom version would be more of a definitive version, but the Game Boy Color version apparently is in a lot of people's eyes, and that's for a few different reasons. It has more content than the Super Famicom version, actually. It's obviously back to a more of an 8-bit style, but it's been enhanced with more color and details compared to the earlier NES version. Sound is a bit more simplified because, you know, it's on a Game Boy, but it's also based on the SNES version of the soundtrack. There is still a day-night cycle. There are monster medals that were introduced, so this is a new thing in the Game Boy Color version. Various mini games, some bonus dungeons, Obviously, it has the save system with multiple save slots in the Game Boy version. New post-game content, so that is extra dungeons and boss fights and things like that. So actually, the Game Boy Color version was pretty nice. So anyone that was wanting to play Dragon Quest III, this might have actually been the best version. Visually, the Game Boy Color version is pretty stylish, to be honest, especially for being a Game Boy game. It might not have as many bits as the Super Famicom version, but it definitely does have does a lot with what it does have. And then there is the mobile version, so that is another one. It has very few differences to the Super Famicom version of the game. It's pretty much just a port with a couple of quality of life features like autosave and things like that, a touch screen, controls, all of those sort of adjustments you would expect for mobile. I'm not going to talk too much about it because personally I just don't play mobile games, but it is there for you if you want to play it on mobile. And then the last one that I wanted to talk about is the Wii version. So there was also this special collector's edition that was released in Japan. It contained not only Dragon Quest III, but also Dragon Quest I and II, which is part of why it makes sense for them to be doing all three in this newer HD2D, 2D, HD, whatever you want to call it, the new remake style. Because this is obviously a trilogy, and you can go back and look at the Wii, where they actually put them all together already. So now we get to the modern remake of the game, and this version is actually quite a bit different. There is a ton that they are adding to it and changing, but there'll probably be even more things that they haven't gone into details about, but they've gone into a ton of detail, so I'm not actually sure. They might have just put everything out because they're just, it seems like all the time they're constantly putting things out, but let's get into it. So there are 3 separate difficulty modes, so that is something that is different. There's the Draki Quest mode, which is the easy difficulty setting. Players deal more damage, and bosses can't recover their HP. The Dragon Quest mode, which is the normal difficulty setting, and then there is the Draconian Quest mode, which is sort of harder difficulty. Bosses have higher HP, they deal more damage, and they also give less XP and gold after they're defeated. So that is the differences between those 3 difficulty modes. There's also performance and graphics modes. That is for the PS5 version, so if you play it on PS5, you'll have those for, 60 FPS versus having all the flair to it. Although it seems kind of like there shouldn't have to be those 2 different modes, but I guess it's a thing. There's obviously enemy animations that have been changed, status changes to indicate when the enemies are low on HP. There is a recall function that allows players to re-examine NPC dialogue, so that's kind of like a log. You might have seen that in different games. Chimera wings can be used inside of towns and dungeons for fast travel, so that is a difference from the earlier version. There are quest markers to indicate objectives, points of interest, things like that. Obviously, that's just a modern quality of life thing. You can probably turn them off, I would assume. In previous versions of the game, characters like the warrior and the fighter didn't have access to spells, and they could only use regular attacks, but now they have the option to use non-magic based abilities. So you'll see that in combat they'll have this attack and defend and all that stuff. There will be the ability section. The latest version of Dragon Quest III also has new episodes, so that is something new. That'll feature new storylines and voiceovers, things to expand on the Erdrick trilogy's lore and stuff like that. There are also, in the release date trailer, there was actually a new monster that was revealed. Previous versions of the game didn't have the dancing flame line of enemies, so you can probably expect to see more new monsters. I wouldn't think that would just be the single one. There's probably a decent amount more new monsters. How many? Don't really know. The game also comes with a new and improved music and sound effects, so that is a new orchestral version of the game's original soundtrack, as well as sound effects. And then I just have this entire list of different things, very specific things. Equipment is shown as in battle, so if you look at your character in the battle, you'll actually see the weapons that they have in their hands. There are battle speed options, so think 2x, 4x for battle speed, that sort of stuff. Multi-hit weapons can apparently crit. That apparently wasn't a thing before. New defense stat. So in previous versions, a character's defense was calculated using the agility stat. Now there's an actual stat for that. You can restore HP and MP when leveling up. That wasn't a thing before. New spells and items, so there'll be a ton of different new things to find. You can save it in churches. So that is a traditional Dragon Quest thing that wasn't in Dragon Quest before. You would have to go, or Dragon Quest 3, you'd have to like go back to the castle and talk to the king or something, like very early Dragon Quests. Now you can save in churches. There are up to 9 save files instead of, I think it was 3 for a lot of the earlier versions. You can view story progress and objectives and things like that. So very simple quality of life things that you'd expect to see from any new JRPG are kind of getting added. There are exclamation marks above key NPCs. Hopefully you can turn that off, because that is immersion breaking and annoying for me personally, but your mileage may vary. There's also the option to rest, so that'll let you do a thing where you change the time from day to night depending on what you want to do, because sometimes there are like quests and things that you need to have it be night or day. You'll no longer need to use the level 25 mage ability that casts TikTok to change the time from day to night or night to day. And also previously you were only allowed to equip one accessory at a time, but now you'll be able to equip a main and a secondary accessory, so that is a difference there. You'll also find sparkling items scattered across the world, so think while you're just walking around, you'll see a little sparkly thing, and you'll find an item there. The remake also has a minimap in the top right of the screen while exploring dungeons, so that is a thing. There's also new areas called Secret Place. I don't know if that's a translation thing, but it just says Secret Place. They'll most likely be tied to side quests or episodes where you'll have to talk to new NPCs or gather new items that aren't in the previous versions of the game. That is it. So there you go. That is pretty much all of the things that I've heard of or seen, all gathered into one place. There is so much information to kind of parse through in terms of that. They just like to spit things out and see if it lands anywhere and see if people catch it. That seems to be a thing with Square recently. They did it with Romancing Saga 2 also, where they'll just shoot the information out to like press releases, and there'll be 20 different press releases that have all of this information. So hopefully this was useful and kind of gathered it all in one place. That is it. Thanks for watching.